This is Polyamory Weekly, tales from the front of responsible non-monogamy from a pansexual, kink-friendly point of view. A warning for our under-18 listeners. This is an adult-oriented podcast about really lascivious things, like communication and honesty in relationships. If you're under 18 and looking for upfront advice and answers to questions about sex, please visit scarletteen.com.
This is Polyamory Weekly, episode 490 for October 13th, 2016. Coming up on today's show, Poly classic topic, boundaries versus rules. That's coming up on today's show. Hello, my fantastic listeners. I am your host, Minx, and I'm very happy to be back on the mic with you folks again this week. We have what seems to be one of the perpetual poly topics coming at you. We're going to cover boundaries versus rules and hierarchy because, we've never ever talked about those before. We have, but they just keep coming back up, and this was a listener question. So if you're tired of hearing about this topic, well, you may want to skip forward to the happy poly moment after the poly in the news segment. But as long as listeners keep asking these things, I'm going to keep answering them. And I hope it's helpful for you guys because every time I answer a question, even if we've answered it before, I think about it in a new light. That being said, our first poly in the news article this week is entitled, Dear Media, Polyamory is not all about sex, and those feet pics. This is coverage of a funny article by Carrie Jenkins, which is really lamenting the fact that whenever any news outlet seems to cover anything having to do with polyamory, there is a ubiquitous picture or a ubiquitous type of picture to accompany it. You've all seen it. There's 3 or maybe 4 pairs of feet sticking out from a white duvet. Now, I don't know if this is saying that all poly people have white duvets. I certainly don't. But it's a way of, I guess, suggesting sex. Well, here's the way it's covered in the article. She says, the photo is supposed to provide a glimpse into the lives of those naughty non-monogamous people having their naughty non-monogamous sex. While only slightly risque, it gets the point across. The point being that polyamory is all about having sex with lots of people. So it's an interesting article. She rails on this photo being used in particular on practically any article about polyamory, and Alan in his Poly in the News blog, and yes, I'll provide a link to the coverage in the show notes at polyweekly.com, tracked down every single one of these photos, and there's like a half dozen of them of various feet sticking out from various white duvet covers in various configurations. And she points out, she says, look, strategically devaluing disfavored relationships by reducing them to sex is nothing new. Same strategy has long been deployed against same-sex relationships and interracial relationships. It's effective not only as a way of inciting disgust and disapprobation, but more insidiously as a means of othering, making the people in those relationships seem weird and alien and not like us. We fall in love and have serious relationships, but those people are lust-driven animals, so it's okay to treat them like garbage. It's a really interesting article. It's very difficult to find stock photos that realistically portray poly relationships. If you've ever gone to a stock photo site, and I do insist on doing that because I pay for the photos that I use, I don't just pull photos that someone else has taken for free off Google because that's technically copyright infringement, and I think that creative people should be paid for their work. So now I'm stuck with stock photo sites, right? And, first of all, it's very difficult to find interracial stock photos. Second of all, it's very difficult. It's either about the sex or it's about family. There's nothing in between. If you're trying to find a family photo of 3 or more adults on a stock photo site, it is impossible. You want some of those to be maybe alternative looking, like maybe suggesting that they're queer or, God forbid, interracial, practically impossible. So we're stuck with damn feet pics. At least I'm thinking on the cover of my 8 Things I Wish I'd Known About Polyamory book, hey, at least it's fingers. It's not feet. It's fingers with little faces drawn on them. It's not suggesting sex. I think it's kind of cute and accessible. But I don't know, maybe we can get some stock photographers out there to take some good generic stock photos of poly families doing poly things and then give people like me access to those photos. But anyway, it's an interesting article, and I'll provide a link in the show notes. The next Poly in the News article came out on October 11th, entitled Coming Out Poly's Stories and Advice Part 1. This was coverage of a piece published in Bustle last month, entitled, I Came Out Non-Monogamous on the Internet and All I Got Was My Self-Respect Back. And this was actually quietly published back in September by Rachel Krantz. And basically, she said 5 minutes after she published the piece, she got this long text message from her Jewish mom, but who'd known that she was non-monogamous, but that she doesn't really talk about it in detail with. And there was a lot of critique. She talks about this experience of coming out publicly on Bustle. And she said that she'd been working as an editor at Bustle for like 3 years. And there was a pattern. The more vulnerable someone is in their writing, the more they are trolled. And she says rape and abortion narratives, usually very trolled topics. And she said in the comments to her article, and any writer knows, never read the comments, but she said in the very negative trollish comments to her article, she said, I had one defender in that chain. It was a total stranger, not her mom. And she said, I was so grateful to her, not just for her support, but for taking the words out of my mouth. What she did was say to the haters what I didn't yet feel the right to say myself, writes Krantz. If you hate it so deeply, perhaps confront that feeling in yourself. Now, I think that is a fantastic thing to say to haters. It's so true. I know it's cheesy, but it's so true that there's a thin line between love and hate. If you hate something really, really vehemently, there might be a reason within you that you hate it so much. Now, maybe it's a perfectly valid reason. Maybe you hate junkies because your mother was a junkie and you really just can't stand them, don't want to be around them. That's perfectly fine. But maybe if you hate a low-choice group, a group like people who self-identify as trans or poly or queer or black or something else, people who didn't have a choice in how they identify, maybe you should look into yourself and see what it is that generates all that hate. What she came to realize in her article was, well, she says, my parents were not my intended audience, nor are the people who choose fear over compassion, i.e. the trolls. She says, my intended audience are people who are also grappling with living honestly. Very difficult. It's an interesting article. I encourage you to read both the Poly in the News coverage of it, which I'll provide a link to, and the original article, which is a link is provided to that in the Poly in the News coverage. So our topic this week is an oldie but a goodie, and I feel kind of weird that, again, Lusty Guy or co, nobody else is here, it's just me, so you get just me talking about this. Candy Floss wrote in to say, one thing I'm curious for you to expand on. What is the difference, really, between boundaries and rules? I don't like placing rules on my husband, but I also don't want things I would be extremely hurt by to happen either. Sex with someone else in my bed comes to mind. Also, I would love to hear whether or not you personally think hierarchical poly arrangements work. For example, a married couple who have secondary separate partners but don't want anything serious from those partners or vice versa. We're not in conflict over this or anything. In fact, we're pretty happy and comfortable at this point, but I just wanted to hear you speak on the topics more. Well, Candy Floss, you got it. So let's start with boundaries versus rules. The way I see it, rules are something that you place on other people. Rules are a way of trying to control someone else's behavior. Boundaries are an expression of your personal integrity. For example, A rule is you're not allowed to fall in love with anyone else. I'm trying to regulate not just your behavior, but your emotions. Now, I personally don't make rules like that. And an example of a boundary would be something like, I need to be fully informed in order to consent to relationships. So if you feel love towards someone, tell me so that I can be fully informed. Or if you want to have sex in my bed, tell me. I will probably say no if it squicks me, but tell me. A boundary is about what you need in order to have integrity within your relationship. So you can see that the boundaries they relate to me and they relate to my needs, but it's also about things that are really rock bottom important to me, which is why most people don't tend to have too many boundaries. It's typically 1, 2, maybe 3 boundaries. But for me, for example, a boundary is I need to be fully informed in order to consent to relationships. So that covers a world of issues that I now don't need to make rules against. For example, if you are taking a new partner, well, to be fully informed, I need to know that you're interested, that you're flirting, what things are going on. One of the things I discovered early on in a very early poly relationship is I do not like finding out through somebody else's blogs that they had sex with a new partner that I had never met, didn't know who it was, didn't know this was going on. Makes me feel like an idiot. Not only does it make me feel stupid, I tend to feel very insecure. It makes me feel like I have no control over my own relationships. The fact that I didn't consent to that, I don't know what safer sex practices they put in place. I mean, really, there's a whole downhill cascade of things that happen when I'm not informed of what my partners and metamours are doing. Does that make sense? Now, another thing I feel like I need to point out, I tend to rail against rules. Lusty Guy doesn't rail against rules quite so much. But the reason I am very uncomfortable with rules are A, they don't work. Anytime you place a rule against somebody else's behavior, they're probably going to break it at some point. So now you have to think about what's going to happen when that rule is broken, because people are human and rules are broken. So if you're trying to control someone else's behavior instead of stating what you need in order to be happy and healthy and have integrity within a relationship, now you have to think about what's going to happen when, not if, but when someone breaks that rule. Are you going to leave the person if your partner has sex with someone else in your bed? Are you going to leave the person? Is the relationship over? Is it going to cause a day's worth of drama, a month, a year? Is it going to break down all the trust and now you have to spend a year rebuilding trust? To me, it makes a lot more sense just to say, look, I need to be fully informed. If you want to have sex in my bed, ask me. That's all. I want it to be my choice. And by the way, I'm kind of with you. I'm a little squicked when other people have sex in my bed. But one thing I've discovered about myself over many years of poly. So at first I wanted to be the good poly person. I wanted to be really okay with other people having sex in my bed. And it turned out, you know what? It really wasn't. I could do it, but it just made me feel weird. I didn't really like it. It just made me feel really strange. And I kind of drilled down to that and I sat with it for a while. And what I realized was that what I want to have control over my bed, right? What I want is the option of offering my bed to someone else. I want to be able to be generous and say, oh, by the way, if you're staying here, I've put in new sheets and I'm not going to physically be there, so feel free to have sex in my bed. That's something I want to be able to offer to people, right? And I want to be the one to offer it. I want to feel generous. It's just a thing that I have. So I'm not sure if that helps you, but drilling down into what's really going on with anything that you might be tempted to make a rule about. And that's actually the third thing that I wanted to say was, first of all, boundaries, not rules. Second of all, if you do insist on making a rule, what are you going to do when it's broken? And third, it's really worth it to take the time and drill down why it is that you feel the need to make that rule. Most of the time, and it's not always true, but most of the time, people tend to make rules out of fear and insecurity. And instead of dealing with the fear or insecurity, they make a rule against it and think that rule's going to work. So now I don't have to confront my fears and I can just go on la-di-da in my little world of ignorant bliss. So what is really the root cause of the desire to make a rule against something? So for example, this is a classic one that many people try to institute when they first start polyamory. They say, well, we can have sex with other partners, but no falling in love with other people. Now, that may seem to make sense because you may want to start sort of with poly light, where maybe it's a little easier to have sex as opposed to do with your partner loving someone. And by the way, some people go exactly the opposite route. Oh, you can fall in love with somebody, but if you just want to go have casual sex, that's not really poly, or that doesn't really work, or don't do that, basically. But the question is, what is the root of that fear? What are you trying to keep out of your relationship by instituting that rule? What are you afraid of? Are you afraid of the person that your partner is going to maybe love the other partner more than you? Are you afraid that the new lover is going to replace you if your partner is quote unquote allowed to love the other person? Are you afraid of becoming less important? Are you afraid of being the comfortable old shoe and having to compete with the shiny new chew toy? There are a lot of things that could be at the root of that. And I do encourage you to do what Lusty Guy and I always recommend for jealousy, which is to dig down really deep and say, what is that fear? And then keep asking, and then what, and then what, and then what, to get to the really base root of that fear. So maybe you say, well, I'm afraid that if my partner falls in love with someone else, that I am going to seem old and boring. And then what? Well, then I'm going to watch my partner all excited with somebody else while we never have sex again. And then what? Well, if we never have sex again, then our relationship would fall apart and we would become one of those terrible couples that is basically roommates and don't really love each other anymore. And then what? Well, then we start sniping at each other and hating each other until we finally end up divorced. And then what? And then I can never find another person who loved me and who I can have that same wonderful relationship with that I have with my partner now. And then what? And then I will die homeless and alone with 30 cats. Taking it to that point of ridiculous, what is the worst thing that could happen? Kind of makes you realize that, you're probably not going to die homeless and alone with 30 cats, right? The worst thing that's probably going to happen is that you experience some insecurities, or some of the flaws in your existing relationship are brought out into the light, and you have some very uncomfortable conversations where you have to deal with those in order to have a successful additional poly relationship. That's typically the worst thing that happens, is you have to deal with some crap in your relationship that only came to light because polyamory tends to shine a light on your relationship insecurities and on some of those cracks. Now, I'm not saying that it will not end up in divorce. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you do have to move out. Sometimes, you have to move out of the house. You have to close down the business that you have had together. A lot of bad things can happen. I'm just saying that, dying homeless and alone doesn't tend to be one of those. So the benefit of this is that if you actually do this work and figure out what the root of your fears is, it's less likely you have to make a rule against something, and it's more likely that you can be more aware of what your personal boundaries are. And once you know what your personal boundaries are, for example, I always want to feel loved. I want to feel loved in my relationships. Okay, that's a good thing to have. So what does being loved mean to you? And now you can start talking to your partner about things like, I want you to text me a couple times a day. I always want to be able to kiss you goodnight. When you come home from your date, I want to be able to mark my territory by having sex with you. This is a great thing that Lusty Guy and Elle do. At first I thought that's a little oddly possessive, But then I realized it's just a wonderful way of reinforcing the connection. You go out and have wonderful fun with your great new chew toy, and then you come back and you get to have fantastic sex with your comfortable old shoe. And maybe you bring in some fun new relationship energy. Maybe you bring in some new sex skills. You're like, hey, I'm trying this thing with a new partner. Maybe you like it too. All kinds of good stuff can happen. And there's one more thing I would like to point out about boundaries versus rules. It's something that Lusty Guy and I talk about a lot. You should always allow for experience shock. Sometimes you make a rule against something because you think it's going to be the worst thing ever. And then you're shocked to discover that when it happens, it's actually kind of cool and you actually kind of like it. Or vice versa. Sometimes when we are making rules about things based on fear, we're not allowing ourselves the opportunity to have new experiences and, frankly, to be surprised by the way we act in new situations. Sometimes things that we didn't think were going to freak us out totally freak us out. And sometimes the one thing that we thought we had to make a rule against because that would so ruin the relationship forever really isn't that big of a deal. So I really hope that helps you out in terms of boundaries versus rules, one of those classic poly questions. The next thing you asked was about hierarchical poly. Well, if you've been listening to the podcast for more than about 5 minutes, you know that I do not personally do hierarchical poly. Doesn't really work for me. I got an ego. I'm a middle child. I need to feel important. Being a secondary or being relegated to a secondary with rules like you can't move in, we can't ever share finances, you can't do this, you can't do that. Even something as simple as we can't have overnights. Shit like that just doesn't work for me. I personally need for the relationship to be able to develop as naturally and organically as if we were single, right? As if we were any other couple that were going out to try something new. Now, granted, that usually means that I'm going to be spending more time with my metamor, who is typically more in a friend role as opposed to a sexual partner role. But that's something that's important to me. So, to answer your question, does hierarchy ever work? Yes, hierarchical poly works for some people very, very well. But then again, so does monogamy. Monogamy works great for some people, and having a hierarchy works very well for some people. I think the reason that we ask this question is because we don't have a lot of models for polyamory, so we kind of default to this hierarchical model because, well, frankly, it's the first thing we can think of. We think, okay, I've got my regular partner, and then everybody else is going to be secondary, and then maybe I have a ring of play partners, and then maybe this. And, there's just something nice mentally about having that type of organization. The problem is that people don't usually fall into nice, neat categories. Relationships grow and change organically. It is not uncommon for, let's say we're starting with a couple and they say, okay, we are the primary, everybody else is secondary. Well, then what the hell happens when one of you, or both of you maybe, have a secondary relationship that starts looking a little bit more primary, where maybe they want to spend more time together. Maybe they want 5 overnights a week instead of 2. Maybe they want the possibility of moving in or sharing finances or co-parenting or any of the other things that mark a traditional primary relationship. Now, what do? Do you force your partner to break up with that person because they were supposed to stay in the secondary position? Well, you can do that, but then it leads to a tremendous amount of resentment. And frankly, I have very rarely seen an initial couple break into poly, have somebody veto a partner for that particular reason, and then have the couple go merrily on their way happily and everything is great. It causes a huge gap in trust that is very, very difficult to recover from. So to me, it just tends to make more sense to communicate, be aware of what the relationships are, what levels they're falling to, and just keep everybody apprised of where the relationships are, where they may be going, and just have a lot of conversations about it and just, give people a chance to air their feelings and fears and deal with that. But all that being said, sure, hierarchical poly does work very well for some people. In our feedback, this was from Jennifer, who said, I don't know if you've got the contact info for the listener who called in wanting more resources for being poly over 50. I don't even remember the person's name, but there's a decent podcast called Our Better Half that covers all sorts of sex-positive topics for the Over the Hill set. Thought I'd pass it along in case it's helpful. Well, I did take a look at Our Better Half. It's available in iTunes and also on Pocket Cast if you use that podcatcher. And I just listened to the first few minutes of an episode. Seems perfectly fine. I disagreed with her, actually, the host, on the topic that she was covering. But I looked at some of the episodes, and it definitely does cover very interesting topics on sex over 50. And she actually does a good job about bringing in different experts in the field to talk about things like female condoms and lube and other, sort of technical details like that.
It's time for your Happy Poly Moment of the Week, brought to you by Fubbly polyamorists everywhere.
This week's Happy Poly Moment is from E, who said, my youngest son has a 2-year-old little boy, and we get him quite frequently, and they also come over regularly for evening dinners. This past week, my son and grandson were over for a visit, and my grandson was sitting up on the couch with my girlfriend's daughter, watching her play on her iPad. My girlfriend snapped a picture of the two of them and proceeded to post up the picture of them on Facebook. In her caption, she wrote, feeling blessed with, and tagged me, husband, and my son, and then in the note to the picture, she wrote, these two bring so much joy to my heart. It is the small moments like this that just bring so much joy for me. Getting to watch my girlfriend and see that smile and joy that the grandson brings to her, or watching husband play on the floor with him, is one of the best feelings in the world. We all look forward to the days we get to keep the grandson, and it's a highlight of the week when we do. Add into that mix that the grandson loves and adores them and lights up when their daughter asks him to play, just reminds me and reinforces to me why I love them all so much. Can I get an aww? It's great. Well, that wraps it up for this week's show. Shout out to our Polyweekly Playmates for your continuous monthly donations. We are a free resource. We help hundreds of thousands of people navigate their introduction to poly, and the donations do help keep the podcast free for everybody both inside and outside the community. If you have a comment, please give us a call, 802-505-POLY, or you can tweet us at Polyweekly or at Cunning Minx, or just shoot us an email, polyweekly@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, folks, and remember, it's not all about the sex.